As an MMO player, especially within a raiding environment, there is a constant push to improve your DPS, healing, or your parse ranking. Achieving bigger numbers makes you feel like a better player, as if you're able to get more value out of the game itself. It's similar to a craft in that you're honing your skills to become a better craftsperson. One of the best tools in your craftsperson tool belt are logs. They contain a near limitless amount of data to pore over and study, filled with arcane knowledge on how to become a better player if you know where to look and how to read them. This is often where people get stuck in their journey for self-improvement within their character. They study class guides, they sim their characters, they practice their rotation, but they end up performing roughly the same every week. And when you're looking at logs, it can feel overwhelming, cryptic, or just impossible to cleave information on how to get better. If this sounds like you, and you've been wanting to learn how to read Warcraft logs in order to improve your character, but you've been feeling a little bit lost on where to start, then you've come to the right place, friend. Howdy folks, welcome in. My name's Rothmar, and my goal is to help make World of Warcraft more approachable for everybody. I've put a lot of time into this game, and I'm hoping that others enjoy it as well. This will be a more in-depth guide, diving into the individual logs from a single raid night. We'll be covering how to navigate a log's different encounters, demonstrating what each of the different graphs and views represent, and how to audit individual performance within a log. I will have a separate guide covering how to use the compare feature, as well as another video on how to audit yourself against the top performers worldwide. Links to these videos will be added to the description below if you're looking how to use those features as I'm able to publish them. Within the scope of this video, please bear in mind that we will be solely covering an individual raid log. This is what you'd expect after doing a regular raid night with your guild. Before we begin, I want to note that there's technically no prerequisites for this video. I would heavily suggest that you have an existing log for your character to follow along with though. You can continue to follow along even if you do not have a log of your own, but I would highly recommend it. To get started, we will begin by looking at an individual Warcraft log report. The URL for these structures usually looks something like this: warcraftlogs.com/report/a list of random numbers and letters. When you first open the report, the initial encounter view, which is what we're looking at currently, shows the entirety of the log's data from a bird's eye view. Think of this sort of like the main hub from which you can then drill down into any specific boss encounter. At the top, you can see the name of the logs, if any. Ours happens to be named January 24th, Heroic VOTI Reclear. Along with who recorded them, this would be Rojo Grande 82, and the date that they were recorded. This is an older pair of our logs. This is from Tuesday, January 24th, 2023. Below this, each boss is listed on the page in the order that they were attempted from top to bottom. If you killed any of the bosses, it will show as a kill and fight duration in green on the right side of the encounter name. So here we have a Heroic Aranog, you can see kill, and it took us 2 minutes and 20 seconds. If no kills were achieved on an encounter, that boss's drop-down menu will auto-expand to show all attempts within that boss's drawer. So as you can see here, Razageth was one that we did not kill this night. We did have 9 attempts on it, and the final wipe, wipe 9, took us 6 minutes and 5 seconds, and we got it to 49% in part 2. Most of your auditing work will take place when you're viewing an individual encounter. To view one specifically, click on an individual boss name and you'll be taken into a view that solely shows that boss's encounter. For example, if we click on Aranog, our view will update to solely show information about Aranog. Don't get overwhelmed by what you see on the screen, we'll come back to this later, this is just an example. If you want to change to a different boss, or a different wipe attempt within the same boss, we'll go to the upper left-hand corner and click on the boss drop-down again. You see this little down arrow here? If we click this, we return back to the encounter selector, and we can choose a different boss, say Razageth. By default, it'll choose the last wipe that you had selected. So, alternatively, if you wanted to view a different wipe, you can click here and choose a different wipe. So we started at Pole 9, we can look at Pole 6. When on the encounter screen, you might occasionally come across the part where you get a boss kill, but you did have wipes alongside it too. If you click the boss, it will take you to the kill. However, if you have both wipes and kills, it will show collapsed like this with this show all button to the right hand side. If we expand this, you'll be able to see every single pull attempt as well as the kill attempt that you can select from. While looking at the overall encounter selector, We can also choose to view the entire encounters selection, which summarizes the entirety of all bosses, all kills, and all wipes together. We can do that here by looking at rankings, all kills, all wipes, or right here, all encounters, all kills, and wipes. This will show from the very start of the logging at 00 all the way through 5.5 hours later across all boss attempts. This kind of view is really good for summarizing information such as how you performed across an entire night, deaths, stuff like that. I will talk more about this later when we cover raid-wide auditing, so again, don't worry about this too much. Okay, let's talk about some practical information. To begin, let's look at an individual encounter and cover the tools and information that we have at our disposal. We'll return to the overall encounter selector screen, and we'll choose an individual boss fight to look at. For example, let's look at Dathia. To the right of the encounter selector, which is right here, we do have a drop-down which helps us scope to the individual phases of a fight. Now, not all fights have phases. For example, in Dathia, there is no phases, so it just says all phases, entire fight. However, if we change this to, say, Senarth, we can see that there's 2 phases, all phases P1 Ice Climbers and P2 the Frozen Precipice, or even looking at fights like Razagath, who have phases like P1, Intermission, P2, Intermission, and finally P3. But again, let's return to Dathia here. Not all fights will have phases, and if your team does not reach a phase within a fight, it won't be displayed here. But this tool can be useful for seeing valuable data, scoped information, and performance about specific subsections within an encounter. For example, if your team is reaching P3 of a boss fight, the last phase, constantly, but you're running into deaths, you can scope the phase to just look at that final phase to see what might be happening. Most of the time, though, you're going to be looking at all phases. And this can be handy for identifying improvements during a boss progression. To the right of the phase selector, within this blue horizontal band, there are 5 options for altering how you interact with the encounter as a whole. The options that you can see here are Analyze, Compare, Mechanics, Rankings, and Replay. I will briefly describe what each of these do, then go more in depth into each of their capabilities in their own sections further into this guide. This will be the main meat and potatoes of the guide itself. Think of this as the appetizer. Analyze is the default view and will be where you spend the majority of your time auditing Warcraft logs, allowing you to see information such as damage, healing, death, casts, etc. If you want to see detailed information about any subject, it will likely be contained within the Analyze section. The Compare tool is extremely powerful, allowing you to compare 2 different logs or players against each other. Compare is great for finding potential improvements for individual characters within the raid. The Compare tool will not be featured in this guide itself because it is quite frankly too in-depth and too much information to cram into one video. However, a link to that guide can be found in the description below once I get that published. Mechanics isn't an actual section, but instead it will link you out to a different external tool named wipefest.gg. I will not be covering this section within this guide, just as a note. The rankings section shows how both the raid and individuals performed against each other around the planet. This is also referred to as a parse, and we'll get into this further into the guide. The replay view is an underrated tool. It is a moment-by-moment recreation of the entire fight in an interactive top-down display. Now that we've had an overview of the 5 different view sections, let's talk about the most heavily used section within Warcraft Logs, which is the Analyze tab. This is by far the most technically dense section out of the logs, since it contains information for every single event from every single character, every single boss, and every single ad in the entire fight. If you want information about what happened at any point from anyone ever within the scope of the fight, it's going to be found within the Analyze section. Because of this section can feel initially overwhelming, but that's okay. We are going to get through this together by taking it slow and going step by step. We'll begin by familiarizing ourselves with what our options are within this page and going through an overview of what each of these different subsections do within the Analyze section. Then we'll dive into how to actually use them afterwards. The first that I wanted to talk about is the Sources menu. Now the Sources dropdown is located here right below the Encounters dropdown. By default it'll read All Friendlies. The source is used to determine which characters, classes, or pets get their data displayed on the current page that you're looking at. For example, if we wanted to see a breakdown of an individual person, we can click on All Friendlies and then look at Hrothgard. And the page will update to show only the data reflecting that individual person. We can even take this a step further by clicking on this dropdown and selecting a type of class. For example, we can look at All Warriors. Now, I happen to be the only warrior here, but you kind of get the point. To undo this filter, we can click on the X icon that appears next to the filter that we've applied, and it'll reset to view all friendlies. You can also use the options that are below this filter, where it says friendlies and enemies, to switch to look at enemies instead. If I click this enemies, you'll see that it's now updated to show how the enemy combatants did, with this dropdown updating to show the boss, as well as all the ads that appeared. This can be useful for determining outbound damage, or how much damage specific enemies received. For example, if we look at these volatile infusers, we can see the instances 1, 2, and 3, and then each one of those volatile infusers in part of that. Once again, let's just go ahead and go back to friendlies for now, and that'll clear our filter. Within the Analyze tab, there is also a subset of additional views that can be used to view the data that gets presented through different lenses. These are found directly below the button that says Analyze, and they include terms such as tables, timelines, events, and queries. Most of the time, you are safe to solely use the tables view, but it should be noted that the timelines feature can have very niche uses when coupled with the casts section as well. Again, don't worry about this too much, and I'll show this off in the future. Slightly further down the UI, the Analyze Filters section is next. This will be the light gray strip that runs across the top of the screen. These are pre-made filters to help swiftly get to common subsets of information within a log's data. I'll quickly go over what each of these do, and then we'll get into how to actually go about using them for actual analysis. The default view within Analyze will show a table filtered to the summary. The summary is a bird's eye view of the raid as a whole. You can see the raid composition, you can see damage and healing done, you can see damage taken by ability, and deaths. Then you will also view a list of all individual characters and how many potions or health stones that they used. This tab is good for seeing a lot of information at a glance. The damage done filter displays a chart of the damage done per second across the whole raid, along with the character's parse, eye level parse, uptime, and DPS. Damage taken is good for seeing inbound damage and how much of it was mitigated by individuals. Healing works exactly like damage done does, but instead of depleting health bars, you fill them. The threat section is not super important, and even as a tank, I don't find this section very useful, though it does have niche applications, so be aware that it does exist and you can reference threat information within your logs if you need to. The next two sections kind of work in tandem, buffs and debuffs. Buffs and debuffs are great for scrubbing through a fight to find information about, well, buffs and debuffs, especially on specific units, as well as analyzing raid-wide cooldowns such as your rallying cry, your healer CDs, darkness, who got power infusion, did someone accidentally not use a major cooldown, etc. The deaths tab is particularly helpful for progression. It helps to identify who might be dying often so that you can work with that individual directly to help them increase their time spent alive. The next two sections, interrupts and dispels, are situationally useful. It can be helpful to identify who is performing these actions and when. For example, if your group is dying to casts getting off by ads or for buffs not getting dispelled off of targets, then this section can help identify who is assisting on these tasks and who might be able to help a little bit more. The resources filter might have niche uses, but generally I don't see this section used much unless you're a caster looking at your mana burn or a DPS trying to avoid overcapping your spec's power, such as your focus, your rage, etc. Generally speaking, be aware that it exists and that you can reference it if you need to. The final filter, casts, can be incredibly useful to help analyze rotation, especially if your spec has a consistent opening rotation that they need to perform in order to do well. Now, this view is not great, and that's why casts is best handled when used in combination with the timelines view option instead of the tables view. Then, from here, you would want to scope into an individual source, and you can see their cast performed in a scrolling horizontal timeline over the course of the entire fight that the casts occurred. For example, if I click in here to Hrothgard, I can see that my opener was to charge in, Avatar, Colossus Smash, T-Clap, Roar, and then I go into the rest of my casts. Coming back to the Summary tab, the final overview item that I wanted to touch on is the Graphs and Events timeline found in the middle of your screen. That's this giant chart in the middle with all the graphs and lines that go all over the place. This section will update based on the source, the view, and the filter that you have applied to the log so far. You can also click and drag within this section to zoom into specific time frames of the fight. For example, I can see that there's this large influx of damage that happens right here, and if I wanted to know what happened here, I can click and drag, and it'll zoom in to show us exactly what happened. Undoing these time zooms can be accomplished in one of two ways. You can either press the back button in your browser, or under the Phases section, you'll see this option that says Reset Zoom, and pressing this will return us to where we can see the overview of everything happening again. Now that we have an overview out of the way of the different filters within the Analyze tab, let's talk through a few different use cases of when you would use the Analyze tab. This will not be a comprehensive list of all possible uses of the tab, but I wanted to illustrate how various information can be found within it. One of the more common uses will be wanting to see a generalized breakdown of how much damage or healing you do per ability. There are a few ways that you can reach this information. For example, from the Summary tab, you can click on Damage Done, and then change the filter to Hrothgard, and you can see all of Hrothgard's abilities and how much damage they did. Or alternatively, if we go back to the Summary page and clear our filter, we can scroll down to the Damage Done by Source section and just click on Hrothgard. They both accomplish the same thing. On the following page, you'll see a list of abilities cast and which did damage during the fight, ranked from their total amount done to the least amount. So if we scroll down here, we can see that Mortal Strike did 23,000, and our Heroic Leap only did about 37. The graph at the top of the screen will be updated to show a color-coded breakdown of each ability, to make visualizing the damage just a little bit easier. The colors are not consistent between the logs, so always be sure to either mouse over the color or use the reference in the color chart at the top of the page for reference. Important parts to focus on within this section would be casts, or hits if they're bleeds, which show how many times the spell did damage. That can be found here by looking at Mortal Strike, and we can see it was cast 61 times. Or I have a bleed called Deep Wounds, which has no casts, but did hit 126 times. Another good column to look at is the uptime percent. Uptime percent can be important for bleeds if your class needs to upkeep them on the target, as well as the DPS column in the far right. All of these sections are extremely important for learning purposes and will be the bulk of self-improvement when it comes to performing better within your class. I'll cover more about how to actually perform these comparisons in another video specifically on how to compare yourself to someone else who performed better than you did, but I want to illustrate how to reach information within this guide. While we are in the damage view, let's talk about how to see which targets that damage was done to. Let's say you're auditing a boss fight that spawns ads, but these ads are living for a very long time and starting to cause problems. This is the case on a boss called Senarth, so let's change our encounter view to look at Senarth. We'll also clear myself out of the sources here. You can leverage Warcraft Logs to determine who within the raid is targeting these ads and who might be ignoring it. This can be done through the Damage Done tab, then looking at the filter below it that says All Enemies. We can adjust this to a specific mob that we want to audit. Sometimes there'll be multiple copies of these mobs, and some may never receive damage. So you can click on the mob's name just as a whole to see all instances of the mob. For example, in Senarth, there's this ad called the Frost Breath Arachnid. So if we click on it as a whole, as you can see there's these flyout menus that appear. We're just going to click on the name of the ad itself, and we can see that there is 3 instances of it. One exists on pull, there's one that exists around 1:45, and then there's one that spawns around 3:30 or so. Let's say that we're having troubles specifically with this second one, the second Frost Breath Arachnid. We can click on the filter here, hover over Frost Breath Arachnid, and click on 2. So if we choose Frost Breath Arachnid number 2, it won't actually show the correct DPS here. So for example, it says that Hrothgar, that's me, is doing 3k DPS to this target. That's not entirely accurate. 3k would be an incredibly low number. That's because the graph above does not update to reflect the actual damage throughput into that ad while it was on the ground. It's still showing the entire fight duration from the 0-second mark all the way through the end of the fight at nearly the 4-minute mark. So we did 3k DPS over 4 minutes. This is because we're skewing the DPS numbers by increasing the S in DPS. We're adding more seconds than what need to show. We can get more accurate into our view by selecting the time around when the ad was taking damage. So if we click here and then drag over this graph and release on the far side of it, you can see that we scope in the time zone a little bit. We can repeat this a second time by clicking right here, right before the damage starts, and dragging it right over when it ends, and we'll zoom in another time. This is going to be slightly more accurate. You're never going to quite get the perfect DPS numbers, but this is far more accurate than what we saw before. As you can see, I've gone from doing about 3k DPS to doing a little bit closer to 44k DPS, which is a little bit more accurate. So we can see here who was doing damage to this ad and who maybe needs to focus on it a little bit more. Another great use case for the Analyze tab would be reviewing the usage of major cooldowns. Unlike damage done, many major cooldowns don't deal direct damage themselves. For example, a lot of DPS have abilities that increase their flat damage done, or a tank has a defensive major cooldown, or there's raid wides like Rallying Cry or Darkness, or even external buffs such as Power Infusion. All of these amplify your abilities, or the ability to survive, or deal more healing, or deal more damage, but they can't be seen by looking at the Damage Done tab. Instead, we need to track them differently through the Buffs tab. If we head on over to the Buffs tab, it will default to showing all friendlies. And this is perfectly fine, although it is a little bit of a cluttered view with a lot of information going on. You can swiftly find buffs like Power Infusion by pressing Ctrl and F for find, or Command F if you're on a Mac, and searching through the page for the phrase that you want. For example, Power Infusion, and it'll show up right here. We can then click into this buff and see who it was used on. So we can see that Emma 2, our priest, was casting this on Lectra, and they got it twice throughout the fight. If we come back though, there is a slightly easier way to do this other than using the in-browser search feature, and that is through the abilities filter located here. So much like the sources where we can see who cast what, we can also search by ability. So within abilities, you'll see a list of every single ability alphabetical, and there's a way to filter it here on the left through alphabet as well. So if I'm looking for Power Infusion, I would click on P, and then I would just go to Power Infusion. And we get to the same result. And of course, we can clear this out by pressing the X again on the filter that we've set up. For major cooldowns that you want to use as frequently possible, or on cooldown, like a warrior's avatar, but you want to see if its usage lines up with a spell's cooldown, we can go back to the Buffs tab and then use the Abilities dropdown to choose Avatar. So if we go to Abilities, and we go to A, and we scroll to the bottom and we look for Avatar, you can see that we have two results. This is because we have both a prot warrior and an arms warrior, which have the same spells, but they technically have different effects because they're from different specializations. To make this easier, we can actually set the source to me. So if we look at buffs and then all friendlies, and we set this to Hrothgar, the abilities list will get filtered down to only show the ones that affected me this fight. And now you can see that only one avatar shows up. If we clear out this filter that I have set for avatar, another way to find this information is to filter to just the warrior, so me, and we can scroll down and we can see major cooldown group and major individual cooldowns with avatar listed within it. If we hover over the icon for this spell, we'll get a tooltip with additional information about what it does. We can see that the spell has a 1.5 minute cooldown, which we'll keep in the back of our heads. If we then click on the name section of Avatar, so right here, we'll get taken to a scoped view of just Hrothgar's avatar casts. From here, we can hover over the beginning of each of these casts to see that this was cast at 1 second and at 1 minute 32 seconds, and again at 3 minutes and 3 seconds. This means that the cooldown was cast within 1 to 3 seconds of it becoming available, meaning essentially this ability was used on cooldown or as often as possible. If there were major gaps here, such as if the ability was cast on pull and then never cast again, this would be a great area to identify and improve upon, using cooldowns as paramount to good performance. The next use case that I wanted to illustrate would be analyzing our opening rotation. Now, not all classes have what's called a static opening rotation, meaning that some players need to cast a non-sequential series of spells that might differ from pull to pull. However, some classes have a very direct sequence of spells that they need to cast for the opening few seconds of a fight. Classes with a static opener can audit how well they performed by leveraging the casts filter within the Analyze section located here. The default view of casts will cover the entire fight, which isn't super useful information, but we can improve this by leveraging the view filter of timelines instead of the table section. So let's switch over to the timelines view. Upon switching to the timelines, we can now see a list of casts in the order that they occurred starting at the beginning of the fight. You can navigate through this section by using your scroll wheel while hovering over the timeline. If we scroll down, there should also be a bar that you can drag. Or if you click directly into the section, you can navigate left and right with your left and right arrows on your keyboard. This is a lot of information on the page though, so let's scroll up and let's filter to look at just Hrothgar. That's a little bit better. So as we look over this, we can see that we performed my opener here, and there wasn't a lot of gaps that occurred. However, I didn't do a great opener. We can see that we charged in, cast our avatar, used Colossus Smash, used our Thunderous Roar, Thunderclapped, then Sweeping Striked, and then dropped into our opening. I know in my head that this isn't perfect. However, I wanted to illustrate how to get to this information so that you can see how to audit what an opening rotation looks like. Again, I do have another video that covers how to compare yourself against people who perform slightly better than you, as well as a video on how to compare the topmost players in the world if you want to look at what a great opening rotation looks like. That said, I did want to show off that even myself do not have perfect openers all the time. A lot of this is incorrect. Ignore Pain should have been back here. It should have been cast alongside. There's a lot of optimization here, but this is where you find that information. The final use case that I wanted to cover when auditing was the death section across many pulls. An example of this would be when your team is progressing on a new difficult boss and you want to identify common pain points within the group. You can do this by finding a log where there's many attempts on a specific boss that were performed. In this example, I'll be using logs from our Mythic Senarth progression. From the Encounters selection screen, which you see here, we can choose all wipes. So we're not looking at a specific pull individually, we're looking at every single attempt that we did across the entire night. This will show a concentration of all attempts into a single view. As a note, there's a lot of information here which will heavily skew, such as damage done, healing done, etc. Since we're now looking at a 2.5 hour long window view with our 10-minute break, some 10-minute break here while we were figuring out some information, a 5-minute break here. A lot of this data here, like damage done, healing done, etc., completely useless. Don't look at this. It is not a good idea to review DPS and healing when you're looking at all wipes. That said, now that we are looking at all wipes, let's look at the Deaths tab up at the top. There are a number of handy sections here, such as Total Death by Killing Blow, which will show you what killed the most players over the entire night. As a note, whenever we call for a raid wipe, or whenever we purposefully kill ourselves to end the fight faster, you can tremendously skew the death logs here. And Warcraft Logs does not know how to count purposeful deaths from accidental deaths, so just bear that in mind. The useful death here, in my opinion, is to scroll down to the player death chart and to click on the average column. This will show you who had the longest time spent alive per attempt on average. A lower number meaning that you were alive for a shorter period of time, and a higher number meaning you were alive for a longer period of time. It can be helpful for identifying who is dying the most frequently to help identify pain points. Note, this is not to shame anybody. I've had a bad night here. I died a lot. I'm the second lowest person on this list. So if anyone, I'm calling myself out. But it does help to see who might be struggling on certain fights, and then look specifically at what's causing their problems so that you as a team can work on addressing it to have a smoother progression. I died a lot here, so let's go ahead and audit mine. Within this table, there'll be a horizontal scroll bar that you can find. And if I scroll to the right through our wipe attempts, I see that there was a 51.3% wipe on wipe number 6 for myself. That's when I died. I died at 51% and everyone else lived for much longer. Okay, let's go ahead and see what happened to me here. Back up on the encounter selector. Let's change this data set to look at all wipes to specifically look at wipe number 6. It will keep us on the deaths filter, and it'll show us a timeline of all deaths that occurred throughout the wipe. So you can see that I died way before everyone else did over here. Looking at the rest of the raid, we can see that a wipe call was likely called around the 120 mark, because at this point our tank dies and everyone else swiftly dies within 10 seconds. We can also look at how long it takes for people to die. For example, it looks like my death took place over 7.3 seconds. That's an unusually long time to die. Whereas most of the raid died to one-shots, dying by jumping to their death, or Sven here who died over 14 seconds to stagger. But you can see that, over one shot, these are people jumping off to their deaths. If we click into me specifically here, we can see a timeline of how I died. So you can see this actually reads from the bottom to the top. So the top is when the death occurred, and the bottom is sort of the last recorded thing leading up to my death. So you can see that I'm at 100% health here. Query had healed me. That's awesome. Thank you, Query, for a wild growth. And over 12 seconds, I died to an unknown ability from a source of the environment. This probably means that I fell to death and that Warcraft Logs didn't quite know how to calculate it, because from 0.6 seconds to 0 seconds, so we're talking a little bit over half a second, I went from 71% health to none. Likely I died by fall damage there, but it just wasn't recorded correctly, so we can infer that. This is somewhat common, so be sure that when you're auditing the logs, it's important not just to take information at face value, but to really dig in and see what might have happened here. Now that we've covered the analyze section, I wanted to move on to the compare feature, which is next up in the UI selection in the top bar. In my opinion, the compare feature is the true bread and butter when it comes to analysis of logs. The previous section helps to understand how to find information within the logs, but to actually improve our performance, we need to be able to look at the topmost potential of what our performance could have been, and then audit the difference between those two. I had actually originally written an entire section on how to use the compare feature within this video, but it added an additional 25 minutes of content to this video, and this video is already getting quite long. So to keep this one as brief as possible, and to help focus the scope of this guide for my own sanity, I've chosen to migrate the in-depth video on how to use the compare feature into its own separate video, which I've annotated now, and the video pop-up, as well as in the description below once published. I appreciate your patience here, and I do feel a little bit bad that this had to be segmented into another video, but being able to deep dive into this feature will well worth the fact that it's going to be in its own separate video from this guide. If you want to see how to identify areas for potential improvement, specifically on how to drastically improve your parses and your individual performance, this other video on how to use the compare tool will be exactly up your alley. Next up, after the compare tab, is the mechanics tab. Much like the compare feature, I will not be covering the mechanics tab in this video because it links out to a third-party external website called wipefest.gg. This is a really handy tool because it allows you to view performance of the raid in its entirety at a quick glance using a much easier to navigate user interface. It's got charts, it's got timelines, it's got grading systems, mechanics, as well as other areas for improvement laid out really nicely. I do not have a video on this tool ready at this time, but I hope to maybe eventually cover it in the future. Once covered, I'll be sure to follow up and link the annotation on this video if I do end up making one. After the Mechanics tab, I wanted to really briefly touch on the Rankings tab. This section is where you'll find a player's individual ranks, which is also known as their parse. These two numbers, while technically different, rank and parse, are roughly interchangeable within the WoW community. They represent how well a player performed within their class when compared against other players across the globe who fought the same boss on the same difficulty. If you got a parse of 80%, it means that you did the fight better than 80% of other players. Or if you got a rank of 400, it means that there's only 399 players in the world who did the same fight on the same difficulty better than you did. While not the sole goal of rating, many players look to their parse as a reflection of how well they're able to play their character, and for good reason. Parsing is mostly considered important within the WoW raiding community. This is in contrast to dungeon parsing, which doesn't really exist. It doesn't matter as much due to the existence of things like the Mythic Plus scores, timers, and keystone levels, which are a much better and more accurate level of performance within dungeons. Parsing is a reflection of a player's ability to deeply master a fight's mechanic atop the mechanics of their own class builds and gameplay to maximize their individual performance within a fight. Because of this, parses can be used as measuring sticks to audit player performance within a raid team, with mostly accurate results. If a player has consistently low parses over a long period of time, it's likely that this player needs to audit how they're playing their class in order to get more performance out of themselves. An important note that I want to touch on is that not every encounter will have high parsing players. Depending on the fight's design, if they're assigned to either an ad or a boss duty, if they have early deaths, if it's a long encounter, if they have any number of nuanced but important playstyle differences, you can result in having an individual with a low parse for a fight on purpose, in order to help the raid as a whole get through that fight. It's important to be aware of these pitfalls when it comes to parses. Parses are a really good bird's eye view to see how well a player performed overall, but should always be done with the specific intention of discovering why they have that parse, rather than taking it at face value. An example of this would be in the Shadowlands raid, Sanctum of Domination. There was one boss called Soul Render, where everyone in the entire raid needed to focus only the boss, while 2, maybe 3 players got to pad on ads. Because of this, only 3 players within that fight would really get a parse. That said, you needed to do this in order to kill the boss. Those 3 players, they might have gotten great parses. The rest of the raid probably didn't get great parses. That doesn't mean that those players aren't good, it means that the fight's design dictated a lower parse in order to kill the boss. That was a lot of caveating information. Let's focus back on parse information. All that said, let's take a look at the ranking page. You can see that there's a few different sections within the UI. At the top, you can switch between today and historical. Since logs are snapshots in time, it's sometimes hard to audit them accurately within the context of players continuously gaining more and more power over time. The Today tab lets you see a view of how the performance would rank if the entire raid performed using the current day's power scale, whereas the Historical tab shows you how the players performed at the time that the log was created. This change in perspective can shed light on player performance, such as I go from a 93% parse to a 99% parse when swapping between these two views. It's also important to note that the parses occasionally get reset because of a major patch that is released to changes in the encounter's difficulty, class design, or if players gear too significantly. In this case, there will usually be a patch selector on an individual character's profile to pick from, which I can show here. If I come over to mine, as you can see from my individual page, we can see all. We can look at 10.0, which only has these 4, or we can look at 10.7, which only has these 2. If you're interested in seeing parsing information per patch, such as if your class got massively redesigned between 10.0 and 10.7, this is where you would do that filtering. Back on the Rankings tab, let's talk about the differences between rank and parse. They're both used to describe a player performance, but there's technically a difference between them. In the upper right-hand corner of the UI, you can see a toggle between ranks and parses, with a description of each located to the left of it. For example, Rankings says, comparing against rankings will show how you did relative to every player's best score on a fight, versus Parses, which says, Comparing against parses will compare against the public parses uploaded within a 2-week window. The main difference here is time frame, with rankings being scoped to how you performed ever across all time, and a parse being contextual to the last 2 weeks. Each has their merits, but at the end of the day, higher performance is better. So that's all really people care about. The next subject I wanted to focus on is which parse you should be paying attention to, the overall parse or the eye-level parse. Within the ranking page, the far left-hand column will show rank percent. This is the overall parse against all players on this fight at this difficulty. The right-hand side will have another column labeled as the eye-level percent, and this number represents the performance on this fight and this difficulty against players who had a roughly similar eye level to you. Generally speaking, I would avoid referencing eye level parses. Item level is an average of your gear, and it's a really poor measurement for how strong your character actually is, since you could be comparing yourself against someone who has a much higher power potential of gear, such as nicer weapons, better trinkets, 4 pieces of tier, which is not reflected in something like an average item level of your character. Because of this, item level is extremely volatile and not a good measuring stick for performance whatsoever. There are some other quick categories I wanted to touch on within rankings on the page as well, namely the execution and the speed ranking located at the top of the page. Both of these cover performance of the entire raid as a whole, not necessarily the individuals. Execution covers how well your team did as far as not taking avoidable damage or avoiding death, while speed covers the raw duration of the fight itself. Neither of these is necessarily important. However, if your team's execution is quite low, such as ours is only at 21%, it means that there's likely the ability to improve or tidy up to make your lives easier. If the speed rank is really low, it's likely that the team's parses as a whole are low because the fight took much longer than it should have. There's one final section that I would like to cover, the replay section. This is one of the more underutilized tools and lesser known features of Warcraft Logs, but you can actually replay the entire fight second by second here in your browser. It's not perfect, and it doesn't show some elements of the fights, notably where floor swirlies are located. Those aren't tracked, but you can see anytime a player or a pet or a boss where ads are spawned, their health, their abilities that they cast. You can see this all in a top-down recreation of the fight, as you can see here on my screen. You can scrub through the fight at the bottom of the screen and use a pause and play button, as you can see here, to kind of start and stop the action. We can also click and drag to sort of get this fast, yakety sack style replay of everyone doing the fight. We can also do things like adjust the playback speed if we want to see it at half speed or at 2x speed. And if we click on an individual player, such as myself, we can even see the direction that my player is facing at that time, and what buffs that I had up, any debuffs that I might have had, and the spells that I'm casting: Avatar, Execute, Mortal Strike, Execute, etc. This section is long enough that I could probably make an entire video of it on its own and go in depth, as I would like to, but for a brief example, let's use the logs from my mythic Senarth kill to demonstrate a few of its capabilities. As a note, you can use your mouse wheel to zoom in and out, and you can left click to move the camera around within the platform. Clicking on any individual character in the bottom right-hand side will focus them in the screen above, showing a frontal cone through where they're facing within the fight, as well as giving you the breakdown of the 2 most recently cast spells on the left, with any active buffs that the character with debuffs in the upper right. We can watch through this video for a while and just watch as my character runs up the stairs, takes lock gates, runaways from the Gossamer Burst pull, swaps between targets, and the ads that spawn on the second platform. For example, if we zoom in here and we start scrubbing forward, we can see when everyone starts to migrate towards the staircase here. Let's go ahead and speed this up. We can see when we lock gate, my character will zip really far. So here he goes, whoop, that's the lock gate, and then we run up here. Again, this is likely too large of a feature to fully dive into depth here, but I wanted to outline that this tool can be extremely helpful for gaining insights into position-based issues or with clarity around if folks are stacking together correctly. This feature, coupled with the auditing done in the Analyze section, can be used for paramount information gathering to discovering opportunities when reviewing yourself for improvement. From this point, we can take the knowledge that we've already gained by watching this video and look through your own logs with a keen eye for determining potential improvements within your own spec. This can be expanded to audit an entire team or to look at what the top players are doing in order to have a better understanding of the differences between yourself and the big leagues. My personal process is to usually pre-audit other top players on a fight before I step into the fight myself, so that I have a rough idea of when they're using their cooldowns and why they might be using their cooldowns. So that way when I enter the fight with my own raid team, I have a higher chance of success since my throughput has already been figured out ahead of time. I can then focus the bulk of my efforts on learning the fight's mechanics without having to second guess my personal performance based on when I use my cooldowns, since I've already figured out the timings and the rationale ahead of time. I hope that this starter guide helps to demystify Warcraft Logs, and that some of the ways that you can use to improve it to look at your own performance by looking at hard data and removing some of the guesswork when it comes to determining parsing. If this guide helped you learn Warcraft Logs even a little bit, please be sure to leave a like on the video so that others can find it as well. If you've enjoyed this guide and want to see more, please let me know in the comments below on what you would like me to cover. And, as always, if you want to see more guides from me in the future, be sure to leave a subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, please remember to play safe, be nice to yourself, and be nice to the fellow players out there.